Most people notice this. You make a decision, and you feel an automatic pull to justify it. To a parent, a partner, a coworker, sometimes to a total stranger. Then, once, you don't. You just let the decision stand. And something in the interaction shifts that you didn't expect. This isn't about becoming cold or unaccountable. There's real psychology behind why explaining yourself constantly does something very specific to your relationships and your own sense of self, and why stopping changes both. 6 documented psychological mechanisms explain why you explain yourself so automatically, and one honest caveat, because not explaining and punishing someone with silence are not the same thing, and mixing them up matters. The Appeasement Pattern. Psychotherapist Pete Walker's work on trauma responses extended the well-known fight, flight, freeze model with a 4th pattern, fawn, appeasing a perceived threat to prevent conflict before it starts. Constant, automatic self-explanation is very often this pattern running quietly in the background of ordinary life, not just in obviously threatening situations. The logic underneath it? If I explain thoroughly enough, in advance, the other person won't have a reason to be upset. It's a preemptive strike against disapproval. The problem is that it treats every interaction as a potential threat requiring de-escalation, whether or not any actual threat exists. The tell. Notice if you're explaining before anyone has objected to anything. That's not communication responding to a real concern. That's appeasement responding to an anticipated one. That's the internal trigger. Here's the social mechanism that trigger is actually trying to manage. 2. Impression management. Sociologist Erving Goffman's influential concept of impression management describes social life as an ongoing performance. We continuously act to shape how others perceive us, adjusting behavior based on the audience in front of us. Explaining yourself is a direct extension of this, an attempt to actively control someone else's interpretation of your actions, rather than letting the action speak for itself. Here's the cost Goffman's framework makes visible. Impression management is constant labor. Every unexplained action is a small, unmanaged risk to your image, which means someone doing this heavily is running a kind of continuous background process, all day, in every interaction. The tell. Ask whether you're explaining to convey useful information or specifically to control what the other person concludes about you as a person. Those are different goals, and only one of them is sustainable long term. So why does that image matter so much in the first place? That's tied to something deeper than social performance. 3. Contingent Self-Worth. Psychologist Jennifer Crocker's research on contingencies of self-worth found that people vary in what their self-esteem actually depends on. Some base it heavily on others' approval, some on internal standards that don't require outside confirmation. Her research links heavier reliance on others' approval to more anxiety, more emotional volatility tied to social feedback, and more of exactly the behavior we're describing, needing your explanation to land, because your sense of being okay is quietly riding on whether it does. This reframes over-explaining as less about the specific situation and more about where self-worth is anchored. If it's anchored externally, every unexplained action feels like a real risk to your worth, not just to your image. The tell. Notice if a rejected or ignored explanation affects how you feel about yourself, not just how the other person reacts. That's contingent self-worth showing up directly. Here's the part that surprises most people. Explaining more doesn't even reliably get you the acceptance you're chasing. Sometimes it does the opposite. 4. Psychological reactance. Psychologist Jack Brem's research on psychological reactance found that when people sense their freedom to judge or decide something is being constrained, they often push back specifically because of that constraint, sometimes with more resistance than they would have shown to begin with. A long, defensive explanation can function exactly like this. It can read less like, "Here's context," and more like, "You're not allowed to disagree with this," which invites the very pushback it was meant to prevent. Ironically, a short, confident, unexplained statement often produces less resistance than an elaborate justification of the same decision. The tell. If your explanations tend to generate more argument rather than less, reactance is a likely reason. The length itself may be triggering resistance, independent of the content. There's also a much older, more familiar name for what's really being protected underneath all of this. 5. Persona and individuation. This connects directly to Jung's concept of the persona, the social mask shaped by others' expectations, and individuation, the lifelong process of becoming distinct from that mask. Constant self-explanation is very often persona maintenance, keeping the mask consistent, coherent, and acceptable to everyone watching, at the cost of ever just being the unexplained, unfiltered self underneath it. Stopping the explanation is a small act of individuation. It lets people respond to the actual decision, made by the actual person, instead of the version pre-approved and packaged for their reaction. That's exactly why it feels exposing the first few times. You're not performing the mask's maintenance anymore, and it's genuinely unclear for a moment whether what's underneath will be accepted. The tell. If the idea of not explaining a decision feels almost physically uncomfortable, that discomfort is worth sitting with rather than immediately resolving. It's often individuation happening in real time. One more mechanism, and this one turns the lens back on yourself, not the audience.
6. Self-Justification and Cognitive Dissonance. Psychologist Leon Festinger's foundational work on cognitive dissonance showed that people are strongly motivated to reduce internal inconsistency between their actions and their self-image, often through after-the-fact justification. Sometimes an elaborate explanation isn't really aimed at the listener at all. It's aimed inward, resolving your own doubt about whether the decision was actually right. This is worth catching because it means some over-explaining has nothing to do with the other person's opinion. It's a sign that some part of you hasn't fully settled the decision yet, and no amount of external explaining actually resolves an internal dissonance problem, because the audience was never the source of the doubt. The tell. If you find yourself explaining the same decision repeatedly to different people, notice whether you're actually still convincing yourself. What actually changes? Put these together, and here's what tends to happen when the constant explaining actually stops. The appeasement labor drops because you're no longer preemptively managing a threat that mostly wasn't there. The impression management workload drops because you stop running a continuous background performance. Reactance drops in others, often producing less resistance, not more. And your own self-worth over time becomes less contingent on whether each individual explanation is accepted, because you've stopped making that the test. Relationships recalibrate the same way they did in the availability video. The ones built on your constant justification often grow quieter or more distant, and the ones that were real
adjust to a person who no longer needs to perform the decision to have it be valid.
The honest caveat. One distinction matters a lot here. Not explaining yourself as a boundary is different from withholding explanation as punishment. Going silent specifically to make someone anxious, confused, or desperate for information you're deliberately denying. That second pattern is closer to the manipulation tactics covered earlier in this series than to anything healthy. The difference is intent and function. A real boundary says, calmly, I don't owe a justification for this, and stays consistent whether or not the other person is upset. Silence as punishment is designed specifically to produce distress, and it's usually inconsistent, sudden, escalating, or timed for maximum effect. If the silence is a tool to control someone's emotional state, that's not individuation. That's the same control pattern from a different direction.
You don't owe an explanation to prove a decision is valid. 6 real mechanisms explain why that's harder than it sounds. Appeasement, impression management, contingent self-worth, reactance, persona maintenance, and self-justification. All of them quietly assume your worth or your safety depends on being understood by everyone all the time. It doesn't. If this connected for you, the availability video from earlier in this series covers the closely related pattern of constant emotional accessibility. Worth watching next if you haven't already. Subscribe if you want more of this.